My name is Sienna Cole, and I was the only person in Meadowbrook Senior Living who still knocked before entering room 114, even though everyone else on staff had stopped bothering months ago. Room 114 belonged to a man named Walter Higgins, 83 years old. And according to the whispered consensus of the entire facility, he was not worth the extra effort.
No family visited. No calls came in on his behalf.
The one nephew listed as his emergency contact hadn't set foot in the building in over a year, and the administrator had made it clear, in the careful, deniable language administrators use, that certain residents simply didn't need the same attention as others. I never agreed with that math. So on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when I found Walter slumped sideways in his wheelchair, his call button just out of reach, his skin cold and gray in a way that made my stomach drop, I didn't think about whether he was worth the trouble. I just moved. What I didn't know, kneeling on that floor with my fingers pressed against his wrist searching for a pulse, was that the man everyone had written off owned 3 commercial buildings downtown, a stake in a shipping company, and a will that hadn't been updated in 11 years, a will his own nephew had been counting the days until he could get his hands on. I didn't know that the reason nobody visited Walter wasn't neglect.
It was strategy.
And I didn't know that the quiet, unbothered way I treated a man everyone else had decided to ignore was about to be tested by someone far more dangerous than a bad performance review. Because less than 24 hours after I found him on that floor, a black car pulled into the Meadowbrook parking lot, and a woman in a tailored gray suit walked through the front doors carrying a leather folio with Walter Higgins's name printed on the tab.
She wasn't there to visit him.
She was there to find out exactly who had been telling the truth about how he'd been treated, and who had been lying. I'd worked at Meadowbrook for 2 years by the time I met Walter, ever since I'd left a hospital job that paid better but left me feeling like a number on a spreadsheet.
I wanted something slower. Something that let me actually know the people I was caring for.
Meadowbrook, on paper, promised exactly that: a boutique assisted living facility, 40 residents, personalized care, the kind of brochure language that sounds beautiful until you learn how a place actually runs when the owners care more about margins than people. Our administrator was a man named Preston Kell, smooth and well-dressed, the kind of manager who spoke in the language of resource allocation and resident tiers, phrases that always seemed to translate, in practice, to certain residents getting less.
Walter Higgins was near the bottom of that invisible tier. He had no family checking in. No advocate asking pointed questions at care meetings. On paper, that made him low priority. In reality, it made him easy to neglect without consequence. I noticed it in small things at first. His physical therapy sessions kept getting rescheduled until they simply stopped happening. His care plan, which should have been reviewed every 90 days, hadn't been touched in 8 months. When I asked about it during a staff meeting, Preston told me, without quite looking at me, that Walter's case was being handled at a higher level. I didn't know what that meant.
I only knew that a man who deserved the same standard of care as everyone else in that building wasn't getting it, and nobody would tell me why. So I started giving him extra time myself, on my own initiative. During breaks I wasn't required to spend that way. I learned that Walter had run a small shipping brokerage for almost 40 years, that his wife had died a decade earlier, that he had a nephew named Curtis who called maybe twice a year and visited even less.
Walter never complained about that.
He just got quieter every month, the particular quiet of a man who has learned not to expect anyone. I was the one who found him on the floor of his room that Tuesday, unresponsive, his blood pressure dangerously low. I called it in immediately, started what I could while waiting for the paramedics, and rode with him to the hospital because there was, quite simply, no one else who would.
He survived. Barely.
The emergency room doctor told me, quietly, in the hallway afterward, that another 20 minutes without intervention would likely have killed him, and that his chart showed a documented pattern of missed check-ins over the preceding weeks that, in her professional opinion, looked less like understaffing and more like deliberate neglect.
I didn't say that out loud to anyone at Meadowbrook. I didn't need to.
Because the next morning, before I'd even finished my coffee in the break room, Preston Kell called me into his office and told me, with the same smooth, unbothered voice he used for everything, that there had been some concerns raised about my documentation from the day before, and that I needed to revise my incident report before it went into Walter's permanent file. Revise it how?
I asked. Just soften the language, he said.
Found resident in distress instead of found resident unresponsive with dangerously low vitals following what appears to be an extended period without staff check-in. We don't want the file to imply anything about facility oversight. I understood, in that moment, with a clarity that made my hands go cold, that I was being asked to lie. Not about the medicine, not about the treatment, about what had actually happened, in writing, in a legal document that existed specifically to protect a vulnerable man from exactly the kind of neglect I'd just witnessed.
"I'm not changing it," I said.
"It's accurate."
Preston's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did.
"Think carefully, Sienna," he said. "Accuracy isn't always the priority here." I left his office that morning not knowing what here even meant, not knowing that Preston Kell had a financial arrangement I hadn't yet discovered, or that Walter Higgins's nephew had been making quiet visits to Preston's office that never appeared on any visitor log, or that the two of them had been building, piece by careful piece, a case for something far worse than neglect. I only knew that I had refused to lie, and that refusal had a cost I couldn't yet see coming. The cost arrived 2 days later in the form of a formal write-up, my first in 2 years of employment, citing unprofessional conduct and failure to follow supervisory documentation guidance. It went into my own personnel file, a shadow hanging over a record that had been spotless until the exact week I'd refused to falsify Walter's chart.
I told myself it was a coincidence.
I stopped believing that the following afternoon, when I overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I'd gone back to the administrative wing to drop off supply requisition forms, and Preston's office door was open just enough that his voice carried into the hallway. He was on the phone, and the name he said stopped me cold. "Curtis, I understand you're eager," Preston was saying, "but a competency evaluation needs a documented pattern first. One incident isn't enough for the court to consider guardianship. We need the file to show a trend." I stood frozen against the wall outside that door for what felt like a full minute, my heart hammering, understanding all at once what I was actually looking at. This wasn't neglect born of understaffing or indifference. It was construction, a deliberate, patient effort to build a paper trail showing Walter Higgins as cognitively declining and unable to manage his own affairs, so that his nephew could petition a court for guardianship and, with it, control over everything Walter owned.
The missed care plan reviews.
The cancelled therapy sessions.
The pattern of unanswered call buttons.
None of it was accidental. It was evidence, manufactured slowly enough that no single incident looked suspicious on its own, all of it aimed at a single goal. Proving Walter Higgins could no longer take care of himself, whether or not that was actually true. And my incident report, the accurate one, the one that documented a medical emergency following extended neglect, didn't fit that story.
My honesty was inconvenient.
Which meant, I understood now with a chill that settled deep in my chest, that I was inconvenient too.
I went home that night and did something I'd never done in 2 years at Meadowbrook. I started keeping my own records. Dates. Times.
The specific therapy sessions that had been cancelled and by whom. The 8 months since Walter's care plan had last been reviewed, which I could prove independently through the shared scheduling system, using my own login, on my own time, in a way that couldn't later be dismissed as tampering with a resident's official file.
I wasn't sure yet what I was building it for.
I only knew that somebody needed to have the truth written down somewhere. Preston Kell couldn't quietly edit it. 3 days after that, Walter was discharged from the hospital and returned to Meadowbrook, thinner, shakier, but lucid, sharper, in fact, than most of the staff seemed to expect or want him to be. I made a point of visiting him that first evening, bringing his favorite tea instead of the standard herbal blend the kitchen defaulted to for cost reasons, sitting with him for 20 minutes just to talk. "They think I don't notice things," he said quietly, staring at the window rather than at me. "The way the visits stopped. The way nobody explains anything to me anymore. I may be old, Sienna. I'm not stupid."
"I know," I said. "I don't think that either."
He looked at me then, really looked, in a way that felt different from every interaction we'd had before. "Curtis came by last month," he said. "First time in almost a year.
Asked me a lot of strange questions. Whether I remembered what year it was. Whether I remembered his daughter's name.
It felt like a test."
My stomach turned over.
"What did you tell him?" "The truth," Walter said. Which apparently wasn't the answer he was hoping for. I didn't tell Walter what I'd overheard outside Preston's office.
Not yet.
I didn't have proof solid enough to hand him something that frightening without also handing him a plan for what to do about it. But I promised myself, sitting in that quiet room with a man everyone else had decided wasn't worth the effort, that I would find that proof before Curtis Higgins and Preston Kell finished building their case. I had no idea, walking out of room 114 that night, that someone else had already begun quietly building a case of their own, one aimed directly at Meadowbrook, and one that was about to walk through the front doors the very next afternoon. Her name was Diane Ashworth, and she introduced herself at the front desk as outside counsel retained by the state's Office of Long-Term Care Ombudsman, following an anonymous complaint filed against Meadowbrook Senior Living regarding a pattern of resident neglect potentially connected to a pending guardianship petition.
I learned all of that later.
In the moment, I only knew that a stranger in a grey suit was standing in the hallway outside Walter's room, asking, with careful precision, to speak to whichever staff member had filed the incident report from the previous week.
Preston Kell tried to intercept her before she reached me.
I watched it happen from the medication cart at the end of the hall, his easy, practiced smile, his offer to walk her through our full-quality protocols himself.
Diane Ashworth didn't so much as slow down.
I have the incident report already, she told him, pleasantly enough.
I'd like to speak with the nurse who wrote it.
Sienna Cole, is it? I don't know, even now, who filed that anonymous complaint. Diane never told me, and I never asked directly, though I've had my suspicions. The emergency room physician who'd flagged the pattern in Walter's chart, perhaps, or someone else on staff who'd noticed the same slow erosion of his care and hadn't known what else to do about it. What mattered was that somebody outside Meadowbrook's walls had already been watching, quietly, long before Curtis Higgins ever filed his guardianship petition with the county court. I sat with Diane Ashworth for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, in an empty conference room Preston reluctantly allowed us to use, and I told her everything. The cancelled therapy sessions. The 8 months without a care plan review. The conversation I'd overheard through Preston's half-open door, word for word, as close as memory allowed. The write-up I'd received the moment I refused to soften my documentation. And the personal log I'd been keeping since that night, dates and times cross-referenced against the facility's own scheduling system, evidence that couldn't be quietly edited after the fact because it existed entirely outside Meadowbrook's control. Diane listened without interrupting, taking notes in careful, economical handwriting. And when I finished, she asked me a single question that made the whole shape of what was happening finally click into place. "Ms. Cole," she said, "did anyone ever ask you to formally assess Mr. Higgins's cognitive competency, in writing, as part of these evaluations?"
"No," I said.
"Never officially. Preston just kept asking me to change how I described what I saw."
"That's the key detail," Diane said.
"A genuine competency concern gets documented properly, by qualified staff, through the correct channels, because everyone involved wants an accurate record. What you're describing is the opposite. A facility administrator pressuring staff away from accuracy, specifically after an incident that would have raised uncomfortable questions about the facility's own liability.
That's not medical caution.
That's evidence tampering in service of a guardianship petition that was never actually about Mr. Higgins's well-being." Over the following 2 weeks, Diane's investigation moved with a speed I hadn't expected from anything involving a courthouse. She subpoenaed the facility's internal scheduling records, which confirmed the 8-month gap in Walter's care plan reviews exactly as I'd logged it. She obtained Preston Kell's call records, which showed a pattern of contact with Curtis Higgins stretching back nearly a year, far longer, and far more frequent, than the occasional family check-in Curtis had claimed to the court in his guardianship filing. And she found, buried in Meadowbrook's own financial disclosures, a referral fee arrangement, a percentage payment, disguised as a consulting fee, that Preston Kell stood to receive from a property management company Curtis Higgins had already quietly retained to handle Walter's commercial buildings once guardianship was granted.
It wasn't neglect born of indifference.
It was a business plan, and Walter Higgins's well-being had never factored into it at all. The guardianship hearing, when it finally came, lasted less than a day. Curtis Higgins's attorney tried to argue that the care lapses were unfortunate but unrelated to the competency petition. Diane Ashworth laid the financial arrangement, the call records, and my own documented timeline in front of the judge in a sequence so plain that the courtroom went silent by the time she finished. The judge dismissed the guardianship petition outright, referred the financial arrangement between Preston Kell and Curtis Higgins to the State Attorney General's office for further review, and ordered an immediate independent audit of every resident file at Meadowbrook Senior Living. Preston Kell was terminated within the week, his license under formal review. Curtis Higgins, facing a fraud investigation that had suddenly grown far larger than one guardianship petition, stopped calling Meadowbrook entirely. Though, notably, he also stopped avoiding his uncle, showing up at Walter's door twice in the following month with an awkward, unpracticed kind of contrition that Walter, wisely, did not immediately trust. Walter Higgins asked me, a few weeks after the hearing, to sit with him while he met with his own attorney to update the will that hadn't been touched in 11 years. I wasn't part of that conversation, and I didn't ask to be. But when he came out of his room afterward, he found me at the nurse's station and said, simply, "I wanted you to know I did something for you today.
Nothing extravagant.
Just something that says thank you properly, the way I should have found a way to a long time ago."
I told him he didn't owe me anything. He told me that was exactly why he'd done it.
Meadowbrook hired a new administrator that spring, a soft-spoken woman named Grace Odom who spent her first month simply sitting with residents, learning their names, reviewing every neglected file personally. I still work the same halls I always have. I still knock before entering every room, the way I always did, not because anyone requires it of me, but because it was never really about the policy. It was about deciding, long before anyone was watching, that every person behind every door deserved the same quiet, unremarkable kindness, whether or not anyone with a folio and a leather briefcase ever walked through the front doors to notice. Walter still keeps that same tea in his room. I still bring it to him most evenings, and most evenings, we still just talk.
Not because anyone is testing me anymore.
Just because, somewhere along the way, that became the whole point.